Welcome, everyone. It's a privilege to have this opportunity to be together with you all. This last day of classes for the main campus. I thought I might get some kind of a... I am shameless. But again, it's wonderful to gather with all of you here in Riggs Library for the 2015 Whittington Lecture. This year we are honored to have our distinguished alumnus, Senator Richard J. Durbin of Illinois, Foreign Service School class of 1966 and Law School class of 1969, with us to share his thoughts and insights on the role of federal government in collaborating with universities, researchers, entrepreneurs, and businesses to develop new solutions to urgent challenges, to strengthen our nation's economy, and to ensure that we continue to be a competitive force in global innovation. I look forward to introducing Senator Durbin more formally in just a few moments. As many of you know, this lecture honors our late friend and colleague, Professor Leslie Whittington, who along with her husband and 2 daughters died on September 11th, 2001, when American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. Leslie was a beloved member of our community, a prolific scholar, an engaging lecturer in the classroom, a dedicated colleague. She played a crucial role in developing and growing the then Georgetown Public Policy Institute, which has flourished and is now the McCourt School of Public Policy. Along with this lecture series, each year a scholarship in Leslie's name is awarded to a second-year McCourt student who excels academically and is committed to service. This year's Whittington Scholar is Akshay Sinha, and Akshay is pursuing his Master of Public Policy and plans to implement the knowledge he has gained at the McCourt School to promote investment in renewable energy and emerging economies through public-private partnerships. As a teaching assistant, he's currently leading a final review session as we speak, and he regrets that he could not be with us this evening. But we are honored to celebrate Leslie's legacy with our distinguished Whittington Scholars and with this annual memorial lecture. And it's a special privilege to have Senator Durbin with us tonight to offer his insights on the topic, quote, "The case for good government, what the demagogues and deniers don't get or won't admit," end quote. After Senator Durbin's remarks, our audience will have the opportunity to ask questions moderated by our Dean of the McCourt School, Ed Montgomery. And I want to thank Ed for the role that he's playing this evening, as well as for his ongoing leadership of our McCourt School. Now I wish to take just a few moments to introduce Senator Durbin. Senator Durbin was first elected to the United States Senate in 1996. He's been reelected 3 more times, now having represented his home state of Illinois as senator for more than 18 years. Throughout his time in office, Senator Durbin has been a model of principled leadership. He's been deeply engaged on issues related to the education sector, from college affordability to early childhood education and child care to the quality of teachers in our schools for special education. Senator Durbin has also worked to ensure that all people can realize their ambitions and dreams through the pursuit of higher education. He has championed immigration reform and was the lead sponsor of the DREAM Act, as well as a key supporter of the establishment of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. These pieces of legislation and policy are designed to increase educational opportunities for young women and men with exceptional promise who were brought to our country as children by their parents. Here at Georgetown, students who meet the DREAM Act criteria are campus leaders, role models for their generation. They're pursuing challenging majors, actively engaged in campus organizations, regularly participating in community service. Recently, Senator Durbin has also introduced new legislation that advocates for increased federal funding for scientific research. This most recent push underscores his long and distinguished history at the forefront of advocating for federal support for the advancement of education, research, and innovation. Senator Durbin, it's a privilege for us to count you as a member of our Georgetown family. And ladies and gentlemen, it's now my privilege to introduce Senator Richard Durbin. Great honor to have you.
Thank you. Jack DeGioia, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It is great to be here to be part of this lecture series. I want to thank the McCourt School of Public Policy, Dean Ed Montgomery, and for inviting me to deliver this year's Whittington Lecture. Special thanks to Frank McCourt, a graduate of the university in 1975, who left an extraordinarily generous gift for the creation of this school. And as I have told and made a personal commitment to President DeGioia and Dean Montgomery, I am only one Powerball ticket away from making the same kind of contribution. My thanks to fellow Hoyers, future leaders. I'm honored to be here in this library. I'll never forget the day I walked in that door and looked at this place and thought, my God, it looks like something out of the Middle Ages in Europe. And wandered up and down the stairs and took a look at the stacks. And it wasn't long thereafter that the new library, the Lowinger Library, was built in memory of a contemporary of mine who perished in Vietnam. He went to school in the college while I was a student at Foreign Service. I was, of course, started what was known then as the East Campus. It was considered a slightly separate and different world than the main campus. It was the world of the Tombs and Tehans and Sugars and Weissmillers and Dixie and and Max and the Shadows and the Cellar Door and, of course, the Little Tavern. We grew up and went to school in that part of the world in a slightly different cultural environment than the main campus. I want to start by just noting that I know there was a little commotion on campus this afternoon when a certain group that calls itself a church came to demonstrate. These folks and their predecessors are no strangers to me. About a decade ago, they started coming to my state of Illinois 16 different times to demonstrate at the funerals of soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. They passed out vile leaflets at these funerals, reading things like, "Thank God for IEDs." Their behavior was pathetic. Congress had already passed a bill prohibiting protests at funerals within national cemeteries. In 2006, I introduced a bill that extended that ban to funerals of all military members and veterans wherever they were buried. President Bush signed it into law. Now, protesters today have to stay at least 150 feet from a burial site and let the families grieve in peace. Even hate mongers have a right to speak in America, but they do not have the right under our Constitution to disturb families who are racked with grief, burying their loved ones. I want to congratulate the students and others at Georgetown for showing those hate peddlers earlier today that their message is not welcome at this great university. A generation ago, there was a governor in Illinois named Jim Thompson. He's a pretty famous man. And he used to tell the story about when he was a kid, and he said, I was 7 years old, and I sat down at the dinner table one night with my mom and dad, and I said, someday I want to be either President of the United States or Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And I kind of reflected on my own life, and I remembered at the age of 7, sitting down to dinner with my mom and dad and saying, someday I want to own a two-wheel bicycle. I never dreamed that I would get involved in politics, and my path to political office was very unusual. I was born and raised in East St. Louis, Illinois. My mother was an immigrant to this country, brought here at the age of 2 from Lithuania. My father's family had been here from before the Revolutionary War times. And I grew up in a family where they were blue-collar, white-collar workers, and we lived a middle-class life, and I loved it. I thought it was as good as it came. I had no complaints about my life or any deprivations that I could think of any measure. There came a time when I was off to college. My father had passed away while I was in high school, and I went to St. Louis University, another Jesuit institution. And I commuted for a year and said, this isn't college. I got to go away to school. And so I went to the Pius XII Memorial Library on the campus of St. Louis University, and there was a long stack of college catalogs. And one night, instead of studying, I just went through them all. And I picked 2 of them. And I went home to my mom and I said, Mom, I'm going away to school next year. Oh, you can't afford it. We can't afford it. I said, no, I've got it all figured out. I was making it up. I've got it all figured out. And she said, where are you going? I said, one of these 2 schools. And she said, what are they? And I handed her the catalog and I said, this one's called Stanford University. And she said, Stanford, where is it? And I said, it's in California. No way, you're not leaving. That's 2,000 miles away. I'll never see you again. Your brother moved out there. He never writes. He never comes home. What's the other one? Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. She said, where's that? And I said, it's in Washington, D.C. And she said, well, your brother Bill works for the federal government. He goes out to Washington twice a year. He can look in on you. The decision was made. And I sent off my application to transfer to Georgetown, and fortunately was accepted. My first visit to this campus, my first visit to Washington, D.C., was 2 days before classes started here to see it for the first time and to be totally dazzled by this beautiful campus and this new challenge going to something called the School of Foreign Service. I picked it because it sounded like a great movie. I thought, I've got to see what this looks like. Well, I was lucky to be enrolled in the School of Foreign Service and to be exposed to people and ideas that had never crossed my mind. Something that many people describe as education. And I look back on some of my teachers, a great economics professor named Father Zerini, who taught me principles of economics. I was scared to death of the course and came to love it. George Vixenens, who taught money and banking. I think back of Professor Hutmacher, who taught history. And of course, the inscrutable Carol Quigley, who taught a course which was required of all Foreign Service students called The Evolution of Civilizations, a very modest title for a course. And of course, when it got into the government realm, I was lucky to have, among many great professors, one who is honored on your campus even today, Jan Karski. Karski was such an exceptional man, and most of you know his life story of how he escaped the Nazi domination of Europe to come and give fair warning to the United States about concentration camps. And he went unheeded and talked to us in a class about the terrible mission he had of returning back to his home country of Poland to fight on in the war without having rallied the United States to support the effort. What an extraordinary man. He used to sit in class, rarely stood, in a starched white shirt, suit and tie, and lecture modern foreign governments class. And then every once in a while would digress into a story about a man who met Adolf Hitler, who I knew. Like, my God. You know, you just listen to this and marvel at the experience. Had a great education, but by my second semester, my senior year, I'd reached the point I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had applied to law school, applied to grad school, and my roommate from Chicago saw a notice on the student employment bulletin board that said, interns needed, United States Senate, Illinois residents preferred. So he called the telephone number and went to work there. He's my roommate, John Stucker, and he went to work there and came home, and I said, what was that all about? He said, that was so cool. He said, I'm working in Senator Paul Douglas's office. I'm an intern. He says, I'm right in the middle of everything. He says, I'm looking around, and there's Bobby Kennedy, and there's Teddy Kennedy, and there's Jake Javits, and I'm thinking, my God, these guys I've read about, I'm working in the same building with these guys. And I said, do they need another intern? He said, I'll ask. And so they went back, and since I was from downstate and he was from Chicago, they jumped at the chance to let me work in the office of the senator. This is a unique man, and you know of him, Dean Montgomery, because he, first and foremost, was a PhD in economics. He was a great and learned man who developed the Cobb-Douglas labor theory, still being taught to this day. Went to the University of Chicago, was elected alderman, the only independent alderman of 50 wards in the city of Chicago, and lost a lot of votes, 49-1, and worked up the courage in 1942 to run for the Democratic Senate, the nomination for the Senate. Lost in the primary. The day after he lost in the primary, having just a few months after Pearl Harbor, he went down to the recruiting station and enlisted in the Marine Corps. The thing that was interesting about his enlistment is the day he enlisted, he was 50 years old. He went through Parris Island, still the oldest person to ever complete basic training in the Marines at that age. And they said, "You're going to the War Department." There was no Pentagon in those days, and we need your great mind in the War Department. He said, "No, I'm going into battle." He was raised a Quaker, but he believed it to be a just war, and he insisted on fighting. And so he ended up fighting in the South Pacific and was gravely wounded in Okinawa. His left arm dangled by his side, much like Bob Dole. Paul Douglas used to call it his paperweight. Now, the reason I give you the detail is because it involved my internship. He insisted on signing every letter that went out of his office. And of course, with one arm, he needed help. So as an intern, I would sit at this conference table stacked with letters that had been typed, as he would sign the letters and put little notes on the bottom to his friends, and then I'd pull the letter for the next one. I was instructed to sit there very quietly and try to avoid breathing. So I sat next to this man, and he turned to me the first day, and he said, "So you're Dick Durbin of East St. Louis, Illinois." No one had ever called me Dick Durbin. It was Richard, Durbin, Durb. My mother called me Joe. Nobody had ever called me Dick Durbin, and I thought, I can't start off by correcting this great man. So I'm sitting there thinking, how am I ever going to straighten this out? And his personal secretary, Jane Inger, walked in and he said, "Jane, have you met Dick Durbin?" And I thought, this hole's getting deeper. So this became my nom de plume in politics, and it stuck. He introduced me to a fellow named Paul Simon, and I got involved in politics as soon as I graduated from law school, going to work for Paul Simon. I went back and, of course, did my best to get involved in government at a lot of levels, and finally worked up the courage to run for office. And I've seen a lot of things happen. The debate in Washington for the longest time was between those who wanted a minimal government, the conservatives, and those who wanted an active government, the liberals. Today we have a much different debate. It's a debate about government itself, about the concept of government and public policy. Now it's a debate between the minimalist, which is the best most liberals can hope for, and the nihilist, many of whom don't believe there should be a government. You may have heard the story recently. One of my new Senate colleagues, senator of the Tea Party persuasion, recently denounced as government overreach laws that require cooks and waiters and other food service workers to wash their hands after going to the bathroom. He said government shouldn't tell business owners how to manage their workers. His solution, very creative: require restaurants that don't make their workers wash their hands to post a sign saying so. Customers can then make a basic choice under the capitalist system. Now, he obviously forgot for a minute that 48,000 Americans are sickened and 3,000 die every year from foodborne illness, a lot of which is spread by poor hygiene. And how, without passing a law, I wonder, do you compel restaurants to post signs warning, "Our workers may have filthy hands, eat at your own risk"? Sometimes you have to think through even Tea Party views of government. Sometimes the elevation of free market ideology to theology isn't funny at all. I know that Dean Montgomery worked in the task force that President Obama appointed to restructure the American auto industry when it was on the ropes when the president took office. I can remember 2008. Our economy was in a free fall, and the auto industry was hit hard. Auto sales were at their lowest since 1970. In the 12 months before President Obama took office, the auto industry had lost 400,000 jobs. The big three, Chrysler, GM, and Ford, were in danger, some of them close to bankruptcy. Finances were crumbling, and suppliers were hurting, and dealers were closing. In my state, employment at the Chrysler plant at Belvidere, Illinois, had dropped to as low as 200 workers. Leading economists warned that if the auto industry collapsed, it would kill another 1 million American jobs, and the country might move from the Great Recession to the Great Depression. What did the acolytes of the invisible hand have to say? Let it fail. Thank goodness people like Ed Montgomery fought back, and President Obama listened. Today, GM, Chrysler, and Ford are all in the black, making profits. Over the past 5 years, the U.S. auto industry has created 500,000 new jobs. That Chrysler plant in Belvidere, down to 200 employees, now has 4,000 workers. A Ford plant in Chicago Heights just added another 1,500 workers. The Export-Import Bank of the United States Ex-Im Bank, as it's called, is America's official export credit agency. It's a small agency created by FDR during the Great Depression to help small and medium-sized American companies sell their products overseas when private banks won't lend them money. During the great financial crisis of 2008, when private lending dried up, the Ex-Im Bank lending expanded, enabling U.S. companies to sell overseas. Today, this small agency is helping American companies, large and small, compete in 180 nations around the globe. And it doesn't cost the taxpayers a dime, not one dime. In fact, last year, the Ex-Im Bank made a $1 billion profit, which it returned to the U.S. Treasury. So let's review. We have an agency helping to reduce three of America's biggest deficits: our budget deficit, our trade deficit, and our jobs deficit. And the Tea Party hates it like the devil hates holy water. They want to kill it. We just introduced a bill in the Senate last week to reauthorize it for another 7 years, which I have co-sponsored. The most dangerous consequence of this hostility towards government and constructive public policy, by far, is climate change. Look at what is happening. California is struggling through the worst water shortage in history. It has less than a year's worth of groundwater left. If you think things are at a crisis point, unfortunately, there's likely to be more to come. A new report by scientists from NASA, Columbia, Cornell, warned that about half of the country, from Kansas west to California, has an 80% chance of being hit by a mega drought during the second half of the century. We're talking about the worst drought in this part of the world in over 1,000 years, far worse than the Dust Bowls of the 1930s or anything we've seen, and it could last for a long time. What do we hear from the climate deniers? Well, they say, well, I'm not a scientist, you know, and the scientists aren't unanimous in their views about climate change. No, they're not unanimous. Only 98% of them agree that climate change is taking place. More and more private companies are demanding government action to limit greenhouse gases. But the Tea Party takes marching orders from two billionaire brothers who have made their fortunes selling fossil fuels, the Koch brothers. They've spent millions to create an industry peddling climate change, doubt, and denial. By the way, a lot of these scientists who are now climate deniers and doubters are the same folks who swore for years there was no link between cigarette smoking and cancer. Now the Koch brothers are vowing to spend $900 million of their own money in the next election cycle to elect candidates who agree with them. Future generations are going to look back at this time and ask of us, what were you thinking? Why did you close your eyes and do nothing as the polar ice caps melted and great rivers ran dry? One more quick example. The McCourt School's looking at health policy. I'm glad you are. Do you know the effect of repealing the Affordable Care Act, which the Republican House has voted to do over 50 times? Besides taking away affordable health insurance from 16 million Americans and eliminating patient protections for every insured Americans, repealing Obamacare would increase the deficit. Let me repeat that. It would increase the federal deficit by $109 billion over the next decade. That's from the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. So I've given you a reason to be discouraged about public policy and public policy makers. I can give you many more. But at the risk of driving you into severe depression, let me tell you, I think there is some hope. Right after World War II, we decided to do something unique. No country had really set out the way we did. We decided to really focus and invest in discovery and innovation. A decision was made by the federal government to be the primary source of funding for basic foundational science in the United States. Scientists at universities and national labs would conduct breakthrough research using federal grants, and private industry would then apply the discoveries made in the university to develop new products and technologies and create new jobs. That's the American model of discovery and innovation. It's inspired countless new American jobs and new American companies. Here's the problem. Our model has also spurred a lot of imitators and competitors. Other countries see what we've done and want to do it too. Now these other nations have decided to invest heavily in this American model of innovation. And what are we doing? We've decided at this point in history to cut back in research. America's place as the world's leader in cutting-edge biomedical research, for example, is at risk. The National Institutes of Health is the preeminent biomedical research agency in the world. The man who heads it up is an amazing individual, Francis Collins. Dr. Francis Collins mapped the Human Genome Project. No mean feat. and he did it in record time. And what he discovered in mapping the Human Genome Project has generated more science, more innovation, more discovery, and more economic development than he ever could have imagined. We estimate at this point in time, it has returned $150 for every dollar spent on the research, and it will continue to grow. And I met with him 2 years ago, and I sat down at the NIH, and I said to him, Dr. Collins, I'm worried. I keep hearing about cutbacks in medical research. What's the story? He said, over the last 10 years, we have reduced the amount of money going to NIH by 23%. Congress has failed to even keep up with inflation when it comes to NIH. And I said, what does it mean? It means, he says, that we now approve 1 out of every 6 applications for biomedical grants. It used to be 1 out of 3. But he said there's something even more worrisome. 30 years ago, 19% of biomedical researchers were under the age of 36. 30 years ago, 19%. Today, 3%. Younger researchers are giving up. They don't believe that the federal government's going to fund these projects properly, and they've decided to go into private business and do other things. Well, we now have to do something about it. I introduced the American Cures Act, which called for 5% real growth each year for 10 years. It's ambitious, and it's costly. Let's be honest. It cost $150 billion over 10 years to put in 5% real growth every year for NIH, CDC, and a few other biomedical agencies. $150 billion. And over 10 years, we are likely to spend somewhere in the range of $20 trillion in our federal budget. Well, what about the return on medical research? I asked my staff to double check this because it didn't sound right, but it is. In the United States of America, a person is diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease once every 67 seconds. Once every 67 seconds. Last year, we spent $200 billion on the care under Medicare and Medicaid of Alzheimer's patients. It is sadly a growing phenomena that as our population ages, they are more prone to dementia and to Alzheimer's and neurological disease. What Dr. Collins said to me is, if I could take that money and find a way to delay the onset of Alzheimer's for a month, 5 months, a year, and God willing, even find a cure, it would more than pay for your total investment in the American Cures Act. It was a great opening in terms of what we can do and what we can hope to achieve. But I want to tell you a story here that is even closer to home. It's a story about a man who many of you know, or some of you know. First, some background. In 1971, America declared a war on cancer. Congress actually passed a bill called the War on Cancer Act. America made good, new, and better treatments and cures for cancer as a national priority. It took 2 decades before that effort really began to pay off, 20 years. But we now see U.S. cancer death rates falling at 1% a year, every year for nearly 2 decades. Each 1% decline in cancer death saves our economy $500 billion a year in decreased healthcare cost and increased productivity. Now let me tell you about a young scientist who was able to devote his career to conquering cancer because of America's investments in cancer research. We like to claim him as an honorary Illinoisan because he earned his MD and PhD in microbiology at Northwestern. His name is Dr. Richard Schlegel. He is a professor and chair of the pathology department at Georgetown University Medical Center. Dr. Schlegel is also the co-inventor of Gardasil, a vaccine that can prevent one of the most lethal cancers on earth, cancers caused by HPV, the human papillomavirus. When Dr. Schlegel was at Northwestern, he worked in a lab with another brilliant researcher. Their corroboration even reached the point where they got married. So for the researchers in the audience, there's another reason to stay the course. In addition to finding a cure for cancer in a lab, you might also find a lab partner for life. After Northwestern, Dr. Schlegel did a residency at Harvard. After that, he and his wife, Dr. Susan Banks Schlegel, could have written their ticket anywhere. They could have gone to work for big pharmaceutical companies and made a bunch of dough. Instead, they went to work for the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Schlegel worked in the National Cancer Institute's Laboratory of Molecular Biology, And that's where, more than 30 years ago, he began his work that led to the invention of Gardasil, the first vaccine in the world to prevent a form of cancer that kills 250,000 women worldwide each year. Since its approval by the FDA in 2006, more than 33 million doses of the vaccine, Gardasil, have been administered to young women and men across the United States. Today, with support from NIH and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Dr. Schlegel is working on an inexpensive, portable version of the vaccine for use in the developing world, where 80% of the deaths from HPV come from connected cervical cancer every year. The goal is to reduce the cost of the vaccine by 90%. Dr. Schlegel exemplifies Georgetown's commitment to smart science with a heart. He is a walking, breathing testimony to tremendous social, economic, and moral values of investing in life-saving research, and he's here tonight. Dr. Schlegel, please stand up so we can thank you. Thank you. When I was a kid, polio was a problem. In fact, it scared the hell out of us. We didn't know what was causing it. We saw kids who were crippled, some died, some paralyzed, stuck in iron lungs for years or longer, and we didn't know why. Every mother had a theory. My mother's theory was, don't go out and play in that rainwater, standing in the street after the storm, you're going to get polio, she would say, and I stayed away. And we saw it happening completely without warning, time and time again. And then there came a day, this month marks the 60th anniversary of that day, when a polio vaccine was invented by Dr. Jonas Salk. I remember that day so well. I was in grade school, but my God, this fear, this scare of polio was finally going to be conquered because of a doctor in his research. Now, I knew I had to get a shot, which I wasn't wild about, but I thought it was a small price to pay for what might happen. At the end of his life, Dr. Jonas Salk was searching for a vaccine to prevent HIV/AIDS. He said, the only mistake you make in research is to stop too soon. He was right. Thank you for doing all you can to help frame and advance good public policies here at Georgetown. But let's make sure that discovery and innovation are still going to be classic American commitments. To do that, you have to inspire, nudge, and maybe push a lot of politicians to acknowledge the obvious. This kind of research will not only save lives and inspire a lot of greatness in other fields, but it will once again validate what this country has always been about. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to take a few questions.
So we have some microphones going around, and we're opening it up to questions. Please, when you get the mic, just stand up and tell us your name and your affiliation, and then you can ask the senator a question.
Fire when ready.
Senator Durbin, thank you very much for both your service and speaking here tonight. Definitely enjoyed the speech. My name's Mike Fox. I'm a first-year Master of Science in Foreign Service student here at Georgetown. My question pertains to those of us who look towards government service. One of the things I've found in my experience is a lot of advancement, a lot of engagement seems to come through partisan engagement. I myself have done campaign work, I've enjoyed it, but I'm here at graduate school so I can become an expert in something relating to policy. What guidance would you have in a more politicized climate for those of us who look more towards specific policy focus to be able to pursue a path that embraces leadership and entrepreneurship?
Leadership and entrepreneurship?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought you were headed to government, but
exactly.
I never took the Foreign Service exam, so I don't know where that leaves me. But I will have to tell you that my education here in the Foreign Service School was the very best preparation, in addition to law school, the very best preparation for what I'm currently doing for a living. So I don't know if any of you aspire to Congress, but if you're in that realm, it helps a lot. And I would say that despite the partisanship and despite the division that you see, there's a lot of important policy decisions that need to be made and a lot of people that need to look at this troubled and complicated world that we live in. I think of the Middle East immediately. We are now, by my calculation, in year 37 of what could be 100 years war in the Middle East. That is really challenging the boundaries drawn by empires after World War II, that is engaged in some conflict within a great religion, that is hard for many people to understand who have not lived in that place. I get a lot of my best observations on foreign policy from cab drivers in Chicago. They are literally from all over the world. And one of my favorites was a couple months ago, and I said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Morocco." I said, "Wow, Morocco." And we talked about his family a little bit and this and that. He said, "I'll tell you what," he says, "you know what, you Americans would be surprised." He said, "We have a large Jewish population in Morocco, and we Muslims get along very well with them. I bet that surprises you as an American." He said, "But when we were expelled from Spain at the end of the 15th century, so the Moors left and the Inquisition was underway, and a lot of Jews left as well. And he said they headed for North Africa, and we cohabited and basically built a country together. So he said it's a very peaceful environment, which might surprise you." And I said, "It's interesting." I said, "Could you comment on being a Muslim? Could you comment on the Sunni-Shia split within the Muslim religion?" He said, "The Shias?" I said, "Yes, the Shias." And he said, "Do you mean the people who insulted the Prophet's mother?" I said, "Well, I don't know about that." He says, "The people who call my wife a prostitute? The people, these bloodthirsty terrorist killers?" And I thought, the peace and light of Morocco has now disappeared as soon as it became a conversation over the Muslim religion, the Muslim faith. And so I don't diminish for a minute the violence or the things that have led to it in the Middle East. And I do encourage you and others like you, we need you. We need you to talk about policies that make sense in today's world. Policies the United States and other freedom-loving countries need to promote. Don't be misled by the partisanship. It comes and goes, and I hope some of it goes pretty soon. But by and large, I believe that we as a nation, the vast majority of people in this nation are looking for problem solvers and folks that will deal with policy questions. So don't be misled by the partisanship. And on the entrepreneurship part of it, I never tried that particular field, so to any great extent beyond my law office, so I'll leave that to someone else.
Thank you very much.
So, okay.
Hi, thank you again for your talk, and I remember T. Hands in the cellar door because I was in '68. I'm on the clinical faculty at the med school, and a couple weeks ago, Jack DeJoy had talked with the med school faculty about the declining research and how we approach it. One thought I had at that time is, in a way, it is a problem of public relations. I think of Dr. Schlegel when he came out with his vaccine, that the university was a little hesitant to go out and promote that for some reasons, and the alumni thought they should have done that right away. What do you see as the public relations, not just to Congress, but to the country, the cultural change? We need to see the value of what you just talked about. Thanks.
Some of you know the name Jack Valenti. Does that ring a bell with you? Worked for LBJ and then became head of the Motion Picture Association and passed away a few years ago. And Jack Valenti used to say, every good speech includes the following 6 words. Let me tell you a story. And when it comes to biomedical research in particular, that to me is the way we're going to win this. Let me tell you a story about Dr. Schlegel. Let me tell you a story about where biomedical research made a difference. And let me also tell you, young people in the crowd here, there's likely to come a moment in your life when you'll be in a doctor's office and look into her eyes and say, "Doctor, is there a cure? Is there a surgery? Is there something you can do?" And pray to God the answer is yes. Most of us my age have faced it one way or the other with someone we love. And what we need to do is to translate the very real frailty of the human condition into this issue of research. When we did a budget vote recently, it's kind of a mindless thing we call a votorama, where you can actually debate for almost 60 seconds before you vote on a measure. And we had scores of amendments, and I went through and said to my staff, pull out all of the amendments being offered by either side of the aisle for promoting biomedical research. And we found out there were 8 of them, and there were 32 co-sponsors, Democrats and Republicans. I put them all in one amendment. We voted for it overwhelmingly by voice vote. What I'm trying to do is to create this bipartisan coalition behind this. The difficulty. Newt Gingrich can write all the articles he wants in the New York Times about how we need this research. The difficulty is to get the Republicans to the point of figuring out how to pay for it. You know, I'm pretty forthcoming on this, tax and spend and so forth. I'm pretty forthcoming. I would raise the federal tax on tobacco products $1 a package, and it would pay for half of the research I just talked about and discourage young people from using tobacco products. It's the T word, though, for many of my folks on the other side of the aisle, and they can't touch it. So we've got to find an avenue, a path to get there on this. But I think if we tell the stories and relate to real life, the Alzheimer's story I told, I mean, there are more that can be told about muscular dystrophy and diabetes and autism and heart disease and cancer disease. Each one of these constituencies has a group of people who are receptive and couldn't give a tinker's damn what political party it is. They want the research to take place.
There's one up here.
Hi, Senator Durbin. My name is Anabi Adoga. I'm a junior in the college studying government and Spanish. Actually got to meet you over the summer when I was working for another congresswoman. And I guess my question for you is, with the Middle East, what does an ideal what's the ideal outcome in the Middle East? Like, what would you like to see happen, like the solution? And what role could Congress, in theory, play in that solution? And why aren't we seeing more debate on the Hill over what the U.S. should do with regards to ISIS and Iraq right now?
Well, it's a lot of questions, and they're all very good. And I can recall back during the Clinton era that there was a threat of a genocide in Rwanda. And the chairman of the Africa Subcommittee of Senate Foreign Relations was Paul Simon. And his ranking Republican was Jim Jeffords. And the two of them reached out to General Romeo Dallaire in Rwanda and said, we hear that there's fighting and killing going on. Dallaire said, if you could send 5,000 military in uniform from the United States right now, I'll stop it in its tracks. And so Simons and Jeffords went to the Clinton administration, to Madeleine Albright and to others, and said, we've got to send in some troops right away. Just a show of force, and we'll calm the situation and stop the killing. They decided not to do it. And it broke Simon's heart, and Jeffords as well. 800,000 people died. Later on, after his administration, Bill Clinton said, honestly, it was the worst decision we made in foreign policy, not to intervene. There's something going on in Syria today that is comparable. What's happening in Syria, I don't know that we can calculate the number of people who've died. Some say 250,000, some say 500,000. Millions displaced in refugee camps, others fleeing for their lives, and the most horrendous conditions. Every 6 months or so, a group called the Syrian Americans, doctors, come to see me in Chicago. These are doctors who literally risk their lives to go over there and go over the border into Syria and to treat people who have been injured. They brought back pictures in this recent visit a month or so ago that are just heartbreaking pictures of these barrel bombs that are being used to kill and maim innocent people. And they showed some of the poor children who were having their limbs amputated and going through the most horrific surgeries in the most primitive situation. So what do we do? What do we do in this situation? We know Assad is awful. We know he's using barrel bombs, as his father before him used chemical weapons. We know that ISIS is bloodthirsty and would behead anyone from the West that they considered an infidel. And there are a dozen other organizations. One day, explained to me by our CIA, we're firing at this group. The next day, they're standing next to us firing at another group. It's impossible to sort out. So what do we do in this situation? I sat down with Tim Kaine, the former governor of Virginia, senator. I like Tim a lot. And we said, we've got to figure out some humanitarian response. So we brought together USAID and said, what are we doing today? The fact is the United States of America, without a lot of fanfare, is feeding 2 million people a day in Syria. We're sneaking in a lot of the food for fear that if it's identified as sourced in America, they're going to be killed in the process. And we're sneaking in medical assistance too. but it's just small bore when we need a much more dramatic commitment. I'm hoping or thinking along the lines of trying to create a safe zone, a humanitarian zone for at least medical treatment. I don't know if it's even in the realm of possibility, but I'm going to be talking to Susan Rice and some others to move in that area. So, long answer, first part of your question, the humanitarian part of it. We've got to deal with the humanitarian part of it and these poor victims, not just in Syria, but certainly in Syria, in Iraq, and other places. And then there's this grand strategy that has to be discussed. At the heart of many of these issues is Iran. And that's why I think that this initiative, this negotiation with Iran is critical, not just on the nuclear issue, but the fact that for the first time in 35 years, we're speaking to one another. The first time in 35 years, we have a negotiation underway. And I don't know that we are going to convert Iran. David Brooks I respect very much, but David Brooks is dismissive, saying they'll never change, they're a terrorist nation. It's okay to be cynical and skeptical about this situation, but we negotiated with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War when they had 12,000 nuclear warheads pointed at us. And we didn't expect them to forsake communism to sit at the table and try to contain that threat. So when it comes to Iran, let's seize this opportunity and this negotiation and try to move it to the next question. You know, what will happen next in Yemen, which has us torn apart in the Middle East? What will happen next in Syria? Iran plays a major part there as well. So I think we have to take small steps. I don't think there's any Congress of Vienna in the near future that's going to bring this together.
Question back there?
Hi, Senator. Welcome to our Georgetown University. My name is Felix Obi. I am a member of the McCord Alumni Board, and I'm also a contributor to Georgetown's groundbreaking Global Futures Initiative. This semester, we discussed developments, which is where my question derives. What is the U.S. government's policy in terms of trade and development? We have issues allowing China more say in the World Bank, but yet China has gone on and opened the Asia Infrastructure Bank. As a consequence, many of our allies are signing up with the bank. This doesn't allow us a say at the table on what projects the institution funds, what the criteria is for approving projects. Crucially, organizations that work on these projects develop trade ties with those countries. More specific to trade, the Democratic Party can't even agree on whether you guys are for trade or against trade. Does it create net economic gains or not? My personal sense is that it does, if crafted in a way that accounts for currency manipulation, if crafted for ways that account for other irregularities, we win. But as the second highest Democrat in the Senate, what are we doing about it?
I want to thank you for inviting me. Sorry, I don't have time to answer that. I think it was about 14 years ago, and I was in Israel on a Codel with Harry Reid, and we were across the table from Shimon Peres, whom I really respect. And Harry said to Shimon Peres, "What do you think is the greatest threat in the world to the United States today?" And Shimon Peres said, "China, don't you see it?" And I thought to myself, there were a lot of other answers he could have given. Loose nukes, terrorism, China. And from that point forward, whenever I would get a foreign visitor into my office on Hill, I would always ask them, tell me about China in your country. What's going on with China? And they'd usually say, well, it's interesting you'd ask that. China has really emerged in our country. They're doing more and more and on and on and on. I then made a trip to Africa and went to Ethiopia. And I met with President Meles, and the late president. And we had 30 minutes, and with 2 minutes left in the meeting, I said to him, I'm sorry, I got to ask one more question. What is the presence of China in Ethiopia? He sat back in his chair, and he said, you don't get it, do you? You don't understand what's happening in Africa today. America just doesn't understand this at all. He said, this is an emerging economy with a lot of developing nations and a lot of growth in the middle class. and China is all over Africa. He said, so here's what we face. We want to build a $100 million project in Ethiopia. China says, we'll loan you the money. In fact, just pay us back $70 million. A few things we'd like to include. The engineers will be from China, the contractors will be from China, and half the workers will be from China. And they'll move into your country. And he said, we accepted it. They never left. The next project, the same story, these concessional loans. And all across Africa, he said, they are players. What are they looking for? Well, they're looking for two things. They're looking for raw materials and energy. And many of these countries that are poor on the books have great natural resources. And they're also looking for an emerging middle class to buy their products. And they have a plan and they have a vision. And we are seeing this, I'm seeing this all over the world. You bring it close to home here because we are about to engage in connected but separate debates. One on trade promotion authority and the other one on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. The latter, this agreement, is going to involve scores of nations, primarily in Asia, and the question is, who will dominate in this global theater in the future? And the ambition of the United States and those signing it is that it be a United States-led effort. So this, in a way, is a response to what I described earlier. Because if we don't do it, China will, and we know they will. The front end of this is the tricky part of the equation. I voted for NAFTA. My friends in labor never forgave me for years for having done that. And I'd have to say, as I look at the books on NAFTA, that the number of jobs created in Mexico exceed those created in the United States. And yes, we did lose manufacturing jobs to Mexico and to other countries, I might add. But it struck me that if we didn't reach a position of stability with our neighbor to the south and help them grow into a mature economy, we would pay for it over and over and over again. So I voted for it. The way that Congress votes on these, Trade Promotion Authority, fast track, is what's at issue here. And this is where it gets personal. Fast Track Authority says that members of Congress have to vote on trade agreements, take it or leave it, no changes, and by a majority vote with no amendments. So many members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, push back and say, well, you're asking us to give you, the president, the authority to offer a take it or leave it treaty that we haven't even seen. In fact, you tell us that many parts of it will not be negotiated until after we vote on fast track. So talk about, going into this with an up or down vote blindly. And that has created the stir, the political stir here. I don't know how this will end. Most presidents, it's been since 2002 since we created Fast Track Authority, most presidents end up getting that authority before it's all over. But Democrats now, my party, is really torn. My guess is it's about 2 or 3 to 1 against Fast Track among Democrats, overwhelmingly for Fast Track among Republicans in the Senate. It is likely to pass. And it is a struggle. Just to talk about politics on the ground, it is a struggle to go home and defend trade agreements. It really is. Most people believe the deck's stacked against them by this economy and that trade agreements make it even worse. They don't see the positive side of those trade agreements. And for many of them, in their lifetime, they may not see it. We may see it in a longer term. But that's about where it is today. I'm sorry I didn't give you a more specific answer on World Bank. I don't know that issue as well. But I do believe that that is what this issue comes down to.
Senator Durbin, I'm a freshman here at Georgetown. I'm actually originally from Iowa. I'm also a Senate intern. So I had just a general question. Do you have any guiding, or could you tell us some of your guiding principles as a politician that you live by, or that you could give to aspiring people or politicians that, for me or other people that want to run for office someday?
Well, I mentioned to you that I was an intern in the office of Senator Paul Douglas. 30 years after I was that intern sitting at that table pulling those letters, 30 years afterwards, I was elected to fill the Senate seat of Senator Paul Douglas. 30 years. So let me tell you what my strategy was. My strategy was to go back home with a wife and a baby and another one on the way and get a job working for the Lieutenant Governor of Illinois, and to decide, a crazy decision, to run for the state Senate in 1976. So I ran for the state Senate in 1976 and I lost. 2 years later, it was close. 2 years later, I planned to run again, and I was talked into running for lieutenant governor of the state of Illinois, and I lost. And then 2 years later, I thought I need a win, I need something in the win column. So I'm going to run for delegate to the National Convention committed to Ted Kennedy in 1980, and I lost. So in 1982, it was a sweep year for the Democrats, and I won, got elected to Congress. And then after Paul Simon retired in 96, ran for that seat. I tell you that story because I don't think there is any grand strategy you can think of as an intern to put yourself in Congress or in the Senate. But along the way, you learn a lot about yourself, and you learn a lot about the business of politics. And I was lucky to have great mentors. First, Douglas and Simon were honest to a fault. They disclosed voluntarily every year their total income and their total net worth in detailed amounts. And they did it long before it was required. And they talked to staff and doing the same thing. So I've done it every year since. Always fodder for my opponent to look through there and try to challenge me on something or another. But Simon used to say, you know, when people disagree with my vote, I want them to think it's because I'm ignorant or stupid, not because I'm craven or greedy, or that I'm making money on this thing. And so that was a good starting point. Simon used to say, and I am honored to quote him, 2 things about government. First, it has to be honest. And second, and this kind of is an indication of his values, it has to help the helpless. There are plenty of people who have plenty of power and plenty of money and plenty of lobbyists, but there are a lot of folks out there who have nobody. And those are the ones who need your help. So my only advice to you beyond that is dive into the deep end of the pool. Start working on campaigns. Find somebody you really respect and help them if you can. Learn what campaigns are all about. And one day you may work up the courage to be a candidate yourself. Hope you will.
So we have time for one last question.
There's one over here too. Oh, there's one.
Senator Durbin, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you for being here. Dr. Laura Anderco, School of Nursing and Health Studies. I worked for your campaigns beginning in '96 as a fellow Illinoisan, and begged you to run for president many years ago. Still begging you. But my question to you, we talk about biomedical research. What about, so my area of research is climate change and health. Climate change is a huge issue. How do we convince Congress to fund a broader scope of science as well?
Well, the bill I did not mention that is a partner to American Cures Act is called the American Innovation Act. And it's a result of my going to meet with the Secretary Moniz at the Department of Energy, and I told him about the American Cures Act and NIH, and he said, so where do you think they get the technology for diagnosis and treatment? It's right here in the Office of Science, Department of Energy. So the second bill, the companion bill, deals with the technology part of this as well. So let me tell you 2 things. First, about nurses. God bless the nurses. What they do in political campaigns is amazing because they have a PAC and they help you out. But in my campaigns, they used to say in Springfield or in Chicago, tell you what, Senator, a whole bunch of nurses want to help you in the campaign. Oh, thank you very much. We'll be available Tuesday night. We'll be at your headquarters. There'll be 25 of us. Got anything for us to do? Oh, you bet I do. And you don't forget it. You don't forget it. And secondly, when it came to the ACA debate, Affordable Care Act debate, the most credible medical profession was your profession, not doctors. Don't take it personal. It was nurses. And when the nurses endorsed, and the nurses said this is good policy, it gave us more credibility than virtually any other group. Now let's go to climate change. What I've tried to do with climate change is to blow past the deniers and to take it to a different level. So I've held hearings where I didn't invite any environmentalist, and I didn't invite any of the folks that you might guess from the Democratic side. I invited the property and casualty insurance industry. These are people who do this for a living and make a living at it. And they every day gauge risk. They follow weather more closely than anybody on Channel 5. And with these weather patterns, they make decisions about whether they're going to continue to write property and casualty insurance in a place like Florida. And they said, not only is the weather more extreme, but the damages are higher than anyone imagined. And that's why we're pulling back from this area. I think the private sector gets it even before the public sector, at least at the congressional level, about the damage that's taking place to our environment. And I think they are starting a force of their own moving us forward in terms of more positive developments. So I would bypass a number of these politicians who might just waste your time and get into the private sector and find out what they're doing, the moves they're making in that area.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want you to join me in thanking Senator Durbin for those wonderful remarks, and appreciate him being here.
Thank you very much. It was great to have you.